I'm Pat Doris. Welcome to The Story. Tonight, we're going to talk about a topic that can be kind of uncomfortable, but it's also unavoidable. We're talking about death. Specifically, how much control you can or cannot have over the end of your life. Oregon was a pioneer in that area and decades ago passed a law allowing death with dignity. Now there's an update to that law in Oregon, and that's our big story tonight. Next year marks 30 years of Oregon's death with dignity law. When the right conditions are met, it allows people to end their life with a mix of medications. It was the first time any state legalized end-of-life care. Now, a new bill signed by Governor Kotek changes the law. More on that in a little bit. Let's stay in the past for just a second. The bill was controversial, as you might expect, when it first passed in the mid-90s and faced all kinds of challenges along the way. Ashley Grams walks us through the timeline of how this all came to be, answering the question, how did we get here?
Long before voters went to the ballot box, Oregonians were fighting for death with dignity and a way to end their lives on their own time. One man who was losing his daily life to Parkinson's was fighting for this law back in 1990, but his daughter wasn't so sure she could support his wishes.
Bob's family knows he wants someone to help him die when the time comes. Bev Ickes respects her father's wishes, but doesn't want him to end his life prematurely.
For that reason, I'm almost glad there is nothing available to him at this point to end his life.
In 1994, Oregon voters first approved Measure 16, the Death with Dignity Act, and it was a close vote, 51 to 49%. For many, it came down to personal control of their end-of-life care.
I have always felt in my entire adult life that people should be able to control the timing and the nature of their death.
But the law didn't go into effect right away. The U.S. District Court in Eugene imposed an injunction after the National Right to Life group challenged the measure. Religious groups, including the Catholic Diocese here in Portland, opposed the measure.
The Sisters of Providence has come out against Measure 16, but the other hospitals in the area, including Legacy, OHSU, and Portland Adventist, remain neutral.
Our best medical, nursing, social, and spiritual resources will be applied to counter the pain, the isolation, the loneliness that often causes the greatest suffering to dying persons.
For 3 years, the Death with Dignity Act hung in the balance. Then in 1997, a second initiative, Measure 51, was sent to voters by the state legislature, this time trying to repeal the original measure. But Oregon voters rejected Measure 51, allowing the Death with Dignity Act to stand.
The law that we passed has made life better for every dying and suffering person in Oregon.
Although the law was in place and patients were allowed access to end-of-life services, there were more challenges. In 2005, President George Bush's administration petitioned the Supreme Court to hear their case against the law. The next year, in a 6-3 vote, the Supreme Court upheld the Oregon law. And Pat, you actually reported on this decision as the Supreme Court was hearing this case, and when I looked at your story, it was just really very emotional.
Yeah, it was, as you can imagine. I mean, it's an end-of-life decision for people, and that case specifically focused on the medicines that were going to be used, and that's how the Supreme Court ruled on it. But, you know, it really is such a personal decision for people, and I remember talking to one gentleman who was thinking about using the law and just how difficult it was for him to make that call.
And Richard Holmes hopes the challenge is successful. He would like to have at least the choice of using Oregon's assisted suicide law.
And I want to be able to end my life on my terms.
After Oregon's law cleared the Supreme Court, other states began considering their own versions, including Washington state. And now, Ashley, I guess it sounds like almost 30 years later, there's a new wrinkle in Oregon's law.
Right, Pat. So it's going to be even easier for anyone across the country to come to Oregon and to use this law. OHA tells me that in 2022, nearly 300 people took the lethal dose of prescription medications to end their own lives. Now there are qualifications in place in order to get those medications in the first place. The person must be at least 18 years old, be able to understand and communicate their decisions, have 6 months or less to live due to an illness or disease, and until recently, patients had to be an Oregon resident. But during this legislative session, lawmakers voted to repeal that last point. Now, anyone in the country can come to Oregon and apply for lethal medication to end their life.
It's hard enough to go through the process. We'd like to remove this access barrier.
That's Dr. Nick Gideons, an Oregon physician talking to KGW in 2021. At the time, he filed a lawsuit claiming the requirement to be an Oregon resident in the Death with Dignity Act was unconstitutional. Even though death with dignity was legal in both Oregon and Washington, Dr. Gideons could not write an end-of-life prescription for his Washington patients.
We want patients who are eligible for medical aid in dying to be able to pursue that. And to us, this is, particularly Washington, because it's legal there. We want to remove the river as a barrier.
Less than a year later, the lawsuit was settled. The Oregon Health Authority explains.
The settlement terms included the agreement that we would not enforce the residency requirements any longer.
Even though it was no longer being enforced, it wasn't until this year, 2023, that lawmakers introduced House Bill 2279 to enshrine that part of the settlement into state law.
And so instead of having the state go back into another lawsuit costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more, it is best for us to go ahead and do what has been agreed to through the court process.
The bill passed and Governor Kotek signed it July 13th. The Oregon Health Authority tells me at least 3 people from out of state have received the lethal prescriptions, but that's not a full count. Because while they can come to Oregon, they do not have to die in Oregon. They can get the medication and take it back home to their state. The health authority says it's perfectly legal.
If somebody uses the Oregon's law, but then actually goes back to their home state, we would actually not necessarily know because we don't receive the death certificate from another state.
It's worth noting removing the residency requirement does not change the other necessary steps it takes to get approved.
Ashley joins me now. Super interesting story going back into the past and all that. What got you interested in this?
Right. Great question. So I recently moved here from Nevada, and when I was in Nevada, I was actually covering the 2023 legislative session there, and they were trying to pass this law in Nevada. So death with dignity is not allowed in Nevada right now, and so I got to hear from a lot of interesting people who were both for and against it.
And then once you did get here, Oregon was talking about this update, and so you went down to our legislature, right?
Right. I saw that this was coming up as a possible change, and I thought it was really interesting. And so that was when I started kind of looking at it, and then to see that it did pass and the governor did sign it, I kind of wanted to look into it a little bit more.
And I know you were there as some people were testifying in favor of it, people maybe from out of state who wanted to possibly use it to end their lives. What was that like?
It's emotional. As you said, when people are talking about death, right, it's really intimate, and it's a really intimate decision for them. And so a lot of emotional tears, a lot of people talking about loved ones, on the brink of death. So it was difficult to listen to people going through those moments in their life.
Yeah, well, great reporting. I appreciate you bringing us this update. Thanks a lot. So what do you think about the new change in the death with dignity law for Oregon? Or maybe you have thoughts about the law itself through the years. Send us an email, will you? The address is thestory@kgw.com, or call and leave a voicemail. The number is 503-226-5090. Well, it's just over a year until we see a massive overhaul of Portland's government. But this week, a couple of city commissioners considered making some of their own changes to the plan. But it did not go all that well. We'll explain when the story returns. Last fall, voters in Portland approved an overhaul of the city's form of government, the first one in more than a century. The charter reform passed by a decent margin. More than 56% of voters said, yes, let's throw out the old system. Those changes are kind of quietly underway now, and we should see them play out in a big way in the 2024 election. But this week, a couple of Portland City Commissioners floated the idea of pushing through changes of their own to the newly approved overhaul. It took exactly one City Council work session for them to learn, not a great idea. First, let's look at the changes that were approved by voters. The city will be divided into 4 geographic districts. Voters will elect 3 city councilors from each one for a total of 12. The locations of those districts have not yet been finalized. The councilors would be chosen using ranked choice voting. You'll rank each candidate in order of your preference. The day-to-day duties of those councilors will change. Instead of running bureaus like they do now, the councilors will vote on policy, while the mayor and a new city administrator will actually run the city. So let's get to what happened this week. Commissioners Renee Gonzalez and Dan Ryan wanted to explore, let's call it tweaking the charter reform and putting the changes up on the fall ballot. The whole meeting was pretty rushed and chaotic at City Hall. At first, the public was not allowed in. Then people there said they were called to speak to the council without really being told what topics they needed to be ready for. And it turns out some people invited by opponents of the charter reform measure ended up speaking in favor of it. So, yeah, it was kind of a mess. Let's start with Commissioner Renee Gonzalez. He led the meeting with reasons why he thinks parts of the voter-approved charter reform measure are a bad idea.
That it is important for us to at least consider whether the city of Portland can take another experiment, and that may go awry. We were looking at the impacts of Measure 110. Many voters, if they had to do it over again, would do something different on that has having tremendous impacts on the city of Portland, on the streets of Portland. And when we look at these charter changes, we at least wanted to take a pause, reevaluate what voters approve, and whether there's anything we would submit to voters for clarification on their intent.
Commissioner Dan Ryan told OPB last week that voters didn't really know what they were voting on last fall, saying there were a lot of components to it, which is true. Ryan was hung up, though, on a poll that came out last year showing that more than 70% of the voters wanted to vote on each piece of the charter reform measure separately, not all as one package. But members of the Charter Reform Commission told us the measure is kind of like a 3-legged stool. It needs each part together or it all falls apart. So here's what they wanted to change. First, they don't really like the new form of government that has a weak mayor. Under the new plan, the mayor will not have a veto, just a tiebreaker vote. Commissioner Dan Ryan said he thinks that's kind of a bad idea, and that giving the mayor a veto provides checks and balances against the council. The commissioners invited Candace Avalos to speak. She was a member of that charter commission. She said, yeah, they talked about the mayor and giving him veto power.
We agreed that a mayor should have the ability to cast a tie-breaking vote if necessary, but we considered the mayoral veto option. However, we believe that a veto on top of the tie-breaking vote would overbalance the checks and balances between the executive and legislative authorities. And this was something that was very prominent in the listening sessions that we had with Portlanders. They were concerned about the mayor having too much power.
So they did not include it. Mayor Ted Wheeler weighed in. No surprise, he strongly supports the veto, but says he doesn't often use it. Ryan and Gonzalez also think the new council is going to be way too big with 12 people. Gonzalez says it's just too many councilors for a city the size of Portland, and he doesn't think there really are enough quality candidates to run to fill that many posts. The commissioners are also concerned about the cost of the change, with each councilor having their own offices and staff. The most recent proposal from the Salary Commission recommends paying the mayor just over $175,000, the city auditor $168,000, and each city council member $142,000 a year. They say they're recommending that level of wage because of the cost of living in Portland, but the numbers are not set in stone. A listening session is set for next week. Last, the commissioners don't like the form of ranked choice voting that was approved for choosing the councilors. This version is called single transferable vote. So you'll rank candidates in order you like best because we're electing 3 people from each district. A candidate will need to get at least 25% plus 1 vote to win. And then it gets a little weird after that. Any votes above 25% plus 1 are transferred to your next highest choice until we have 3 candidates pass the 25 plus 1 threshold. And congratulations, those are the winners. Ranked choice voting has become more popular around the country in recent years. In Oregon, voters just approved a different form of ranked choice voting to be used for Multnomah County offices. And a statewide bill is in the works for Oregon voters for next year. City commissioners invited an advocate from Ranked Choice Voting Oregon to speak. He said single transferable voting works just fine, and he added that city council needs to get their act together for voters.
Democracy is a dumpster fire right now. There are huge concerns at the city and national level, and to go back and forth in front of voters, it makes us look like a clown car, and it's not going to build trust. And I can't imagine that the implementation work gets any easier should these pass or not, or this goes any better with an even shorter, more compressed timeline if there are changes.
In the end, the city commissioners got a lot more testimony in favor of not messing with the charter reform measure that voters had passed. Dan Ryan pulled his support for the changes yesterday, and Rene Gonzalez said that without support, he will not send the ranked choice voting and the size of the city council issues to voters. But both said they do want to keep pursuing the mayor veto option, possibly with a ballot measure next spring. So here's my opinion on all this. I'm glad the idea of tinkering with 2 of the 3 charter reforms which just recently passed is mostly dead. I've interviewed both commissioners who wanted the change, Dan Ryan and Rene Gonzalez. I think they have a lot of good ideas for the future of our city. But trying to change the things that voters just approved for this new form of government, no, bad idea. It doesn't matter if they're right. They are the folks in power now. And it's impossible for this to look like anything other than an attempt to keep the power that they have. Now, they probably have the best intentions in the world, but there are so many other pressing issues facing our city. This is not one that they should be wasting their time on. Look, if it turns out the new Portland form of government is a mess, which it could be, voters can always pressure the new city council to make changes in the future. And if it is, I'll invite Dan Ryan and Rene Gonzalez to sit down for an interview on this show and explain in detail why I'm an idiot and we all should have listened to them. In the meantime, fellas, leave it alone. This is not the time to be tinkering with the first change approved by Portland voters in 110 years. At least that's my opinion. You don't have to agree, but you do have to communicate. What do you think? Send me an email, will you? The address is thestory@kgw.com or call and leave a voicemail. The phone number is 503-226-5090. By the way, your feedback is what makes this show unique in the entire Northwest. You become part of the story. So please do share your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you. Still to come on The Story. We're going to take a look at some of your emails and voicemails after our segment yesterday on the mom who can't find help for her adult son with severe mental illness. Many of you chimed in with stories of your own, and we think they're worth a listen. It's what makes the show unique, remember? Stick around. We're back right after this.
Next at 6:30, a local family demands answers after a homicide investigation into their daughter's death ends abruptly. How they're trying to get the feds involved now to get answers. Plus, it's been 1 year since the launch of a 988 mental health crisis hotline. A progress report on how the service is helping Oregonians. And it's been more than 25 years since Amtrak trains ran between Portland and Salt Lake City, the city that's now leading the effort to revive the Pioneer Line. Those stories and more coming up at 6:30.
On yesterday's story, we brought you the heart-wrenching story of one mom's struggle with her son's severe mental illness. The man is named Brett, and he's been forced into treatment at the Oregon State Hospital 4 separate times. But his mom says after the civil commitment hold of 6 months is up, he's released from the hospital and Brett goes off his meds and spirals. It's a story that hit home for many of you who sent us emails and voicemails with your own stories about mental illness and the problems with the systems currently in place.
This mirrors what I've journeyed with my son, who just turned 42 in May. My son's actually been committed more than 4 times to the Oregon State Hospital and is currently there under an aid and assist situation. So I'd love to tell my story. I would also love to talk to the mother and encourage her and give her a hug or just talk to her because that story echoed my story to almost a T.
And Jan wrote to us, the story hit home today. For 50 years, my nephew has gone through the same problems, schizophrenia, bipolar, that Brett's mother so bravely and lovingly shared on the show. We're missing too many steps and resources for effectively managing the mentally ill community. And how about this from Barry? The feature about a lack of mental health long-term care for Brett in tonight's episode was stirring and disturbing. Barry says he remembers learning about the idea to return the mentally ill back to their communities rather than institutionalize them way back in the 60s. He says the concept was compelling, but as he puts it, what was not disclosed was the utter failure of the state in those and subsequent years to assist or fund substitute networks for this long-term care. This decision policy seemed to shift the responsibility for care into an abyss of indifference. And a viewer named GP wrote in, "My take, Pat, a complete and utter failure of society. We need to completely revamp our mental health care system. I doubt that will happen anytime soon, sadly." And we want to end with another voicemail from a viewer named Brenda, who understandably got emotional when sharing her harrowing personal experience.
My son is in jail now. He just tried to kill me and put me in the hospital for over 2 weeks because of his mental illness. Something needs to be done for these people. You can't just put them in the hospital and give them pills and then kick them to the curb and say that they're well. There's other things that need to be done for these people, not just the drugs. The drugs made my son a vegetable, and when he's not on them, he's a violent person. Please keep airing more stories about this.
We certainly will, Brenda. And if you're sitting at home and feel like sharing something like this going on in your life, feel free to send it our way. The email is thestory@kgw.com, or you can call and leave us a voicemail, 503-226-5090. Well, that's the end of our show. Thanks so much for watching and being part of our show. And remember, the story, our collective story, well, that never ends. Stick around now for the news at 6:30. Then I'll see you right back here tomorrow.